The morning sun cast long shadows across the private terminal at Atlanta International Airport as Dr. Michelle Richardson checked her watch for the third time. It was 7:45 a.m., and she had exactly 45 minutes until her scheduled departure. Her sensible heels clicked against the polished floor as she walked, rolling her small carry-on suitcase behind her. The sound echoed through the quiet, exclusive terminal where private jets waited for their wealthy passengers. Dr. Richardson looked like success itself in her perfectly pressed navy blue suit and pearl earrings, gifts she had bought herself after her first major surgery. At 38 years old, she had earned every bit of her position as one of the country's top neurosurgeons. Her natural hair was pulled back neatly into a bun, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had broken barriers her entire life. The private terminal was different from the main airport areas. Instead of crowds and long lines, there were plush leather seats and soft classical music playing in the background. The walls displayed expensive artwork, and smartly dressed staff members moved quietly around helping the few passengers present. It wasn't Dr. Richardson's first time here. She had flown private many times before when hospitals across the country needed her surgical skills urgently. Today's flight was for a different but equally important reason. She was scheduled to give the keynote speech at a major medical conference in Los Angeles. Her presentation would focus on a new surgical technique she had developed, one that had already saved dozens of lives. The medical journal that published her research had called it a breakthrough in modern neurosurgery. As she approached the security checkpoint, Dr. Richardson reached into her designer bag for her credentials. Her fingers brushed past her phone, which had been buzzing all morning with messages from her team at Atlanta General Hospital. Even on her way to the conference, she was managing her department remotely. Just an hour ago, she had finished a video call advising on a complex case, her expertise needed even when she wasn't physically present. The terminal's large windows offered a clear view of the private jets parked outside. Dr. Richardson could see her chartered plane, a sleek Gulfstream G650 that would get her to Los Angeles in plenty of time for her afternoon presentation. The pilot was already doing the pre-flight checks, walking around the aircraft with practiced precision. She smiled, remembering her first time on a private jet 5 years ago. It had been an emergency call from a hospital in Miami. A 7-year-old girl needed immediate surgery for a brain tumor. That flight had changed everything. The girl not only survived but thrived, and now sent Dr. Richardson a birthday card every year with updates about her life. Looking through her bag, Dr. Richardson organized her documents neatly: her pilot-approved ID, the private flight authorization, her medical credentials, and the conference invitation. She had learned early in her career to always be overprepared. As one of the few black women in her field, she knew that sometimes she had to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. The morning air conditioning made the terminal slightly chilly, and Dr. Richardson pulled her suit jacket a little closer. She could smell the rich aroma of coffee coming from the private lounge nearby, but there wasn't time for that now. Her presentation files needed one final review before the flight, and she planned to use the quiet hours in the air productively. Other passengers in the terminal, mostly business executives and a few celebrities, were absorbed in their phones or laptops. A few looked up as she walked past, then returned to their own worlds. Dr. Richardson was used to this too: the quick glances, the double takes, the subtle reactions to seeing a black woman in spaces traditionally reserved for others. But none of that mattered to her now. Her mind was already in Los Angeles, reviewing the key points of her presentation. She knew her research could change how hospitals approached certain types of brain surgery. More importantly, it could save more lives, and that had always been her driving force. As she reached the security checkpoint, Dr. Richardson straightened her shoulders and put on her professional smile. The morning light streaming through the windows caught her pearl earrings, making them gleam. She had no way of knowing that in the next few minutes, everything about this routine travel day was about to change dramatically. Thomas Peterson stood at his security post, his 6 years as a guard at the private terminal giving him an air of authority that he wore like his pressed uniform. He watched as Dr. Richardson approached, his eyes narrowing slightly. In all his time working here, he had developed what he called a sense about who belonged and who didn't. Today, that bias was about to expose itself in the worst way possible. "Excuse me, ma'am," Peterson said, stepping directly into Dr. Richardson's path. His voice carried that special kind of false politeness that barely hidden something uglier underneath. "This is a private terminal. I think you might be lost." He didn't even look at the credentials she was already holding out. Dr. Richardson took a calm breath. She had faced moments like this before, in medical school, at conferences, even in her own hospital's parking lot. "I'm Dr. Michelle Richardson," she said clearly, her voice steady and professional. "I have a private flight scheduled for 8:30 a.m. to Los Angeles." She extended her documents again. Peterson crossed his arms, making no move to take the papers. "Right," he said, drawing out the word. "And I'm the President of the United States." A few nearby passengers looked up from their phones, starting to notice the interaction. "Why don't you head back to the main terminal? That's where your flight will be." Dr. Richardson stood her ground, her years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room serving her well now. "Sir, here are my credentials, my flight authorization, and my ID." She laid them out one by one on the security desk. "You can verify everything with the flight coordinator." Peterson finally glanced at the documents, but his expression remained skeptical. "These look pretty fancy," he said, picking up her medical license with two fingers like it might bite him. "Must have cost a lot to get these made up. We get all kinds trying to sneak in here, you know." The terminal had grown quieter now. Other travelers were openly watching, some with discomfort, others with growing anger at what they were witnessing. A young woman in the corner had already taken out her phone and was recording. "I don't make fake documents, Mr. Peterson," Dr. Richardson said, reading his name tag. "I perform brain surgery. I'm scheduled to give a keynote speech at the National Medical Conference in Los Angeles this afternoon. You can call the hospital. You can call the conference organizers. You can call the flight service. All of these numbers are right there on my paperwork." Peterson's face reddened slightly, but he doubled down. "Look, I don't care if you say you're the Queen of England. I know what kinds of people are allowed in here, and you're not one of them. Now, are you going to leave on your own, or do I need to call for backup?" Dr. Richardson felt her heart racing, but her voice remained calm. Years of training had taught her that keeping cool in tense situations was often the difference between life and death. This wasn't brain surgery, but the principle was the same. "Mr. Peterson," she said, taking out her phone, "I'm going to call my flight service right now. I'm also going to call your supervisor. While we wait for them, I suggest you take a proper look at my documentation. My patient records show that I've flown out of this terminal 8 times in the past year alone for emergency surgeries across the country." Peterson's hand moved to his radio, but he hesitated. Something in Dr. Richardson's steady gaze made him pause. She wasn't acting like someone who was lying. She wasn't getting emotional or raising her voice like others did when he confronted them. The growing audience in the terminal had increased to about a dozen people now. A businessman in an expensive suit had put down his newspaper and was frowning deeply at Peterson. 2 flight attendants had stopped their conversation to watch, one of them already on her phone, speaking quietly but urgently. Dr. Richardson checked her watch again. 20 minutes until her scheduled departure. She had handled 6-hour brain surgeries with less stress than this moment, but she wouldn't let Peterson see that. She stood perfectly still, her documents still laid out on the desk, her phone in her hand, waiting to see what would happen next. The tension in the terminal was thick enough to cut with a scalpel, and then from behind Peterson, a familiar voice called out, "Dr. Richardson, is there a problem here?" As Dr. Richardson stood there, facing Peterson's discrimination, her mind traveled back through the years. The cold terminal around her faded away, replaced by memories of her journey, memories that had shaped her into the woman she was today. She remembered the small apartment in Detroit where she grew up, the one her mother kept spotlessly clean despite working 2 jobs. The kitchen table where young Michelle did her homework was also where her mother counted pennies late at night, making sure they had enough for Michelle's school supplies. The dim light above that table had witnessed countless hours of study, determination, and dreams. In her mind, she saw her old high school chemistry teacher, Mrs. Thompson, who had stayed after school to help Michelle with extra science projects. "You got something special," Mrs. Thompson had told her one afternoon while they worked on a particularly difficult experiment. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Those words had carried her through many dark days. The memory shifted to her first day at Johns Hopkins Medical School. She had arrived early, her second-hand suits pressed perfectly, carrying a scholarship that would cover her entire education. The hallways had seemed enormous then, filled with students from wealthy families who had never worried about buying textbooks or paying tuition. Some of them had looked at her the same way Peterson was looking at her now, like she didn't belong. But Michelle had proved them wrong, just as she would prove Peterson wrong today. She remembered the long nights studying in the library, often being the last one to leave. While other students went to parties or took vacations, she worked as a research assistant to earn extra money. Every grade, every test, every practical exam, she had to be better than good. She had to be exceptional. The image of her graduation day flashed through her mind. Her mother had cried when Michelle walked across the stage, graduating at the top of her class. The same professors who had once seemed intimidating were now shaking her hand, congratulating her on her groundbreaking research project. That day, she wasn't just Dr. Michelle Richardson. She was the hope of every black girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor. Her first surgery as a lead neurosurgeon played in her memory like a movie. Her hands had been steady, her mind focused, as she worked to remove a tumor that other doctors had deemed inoperable. The patient was a young white man from a wealthy family, and his parents had initially requested a different surgeon. But after the successful operation, they had hugged her with tears in their eyes, their prejudices forgotten in the face of her skill. She thought about her office at Atlanta General Hospital, where her walls now displayed not only her numerous degrees and certifications, but also letters from grateful patients. People of all races, backgrounds, and beliefs had laid their lives in her hands. In the operating room, she had proven time and again that excellence knows no color. Last month's case came to mind, a particularly challenging surgery on a 6-year-old girl. The procedure had lasted 11 hours, but Dr. Richardson hadn't taken a single break. When the girl opened her eyes 2 days later, able to move and speak normally, the entire surgical team had celebrated. That little girl would now grow up, go to school, and maybe even become a doctor herself one day. The thought of her current research project made her stand even straighter. Her new surgical technique wasn't just about advancing medical science. It was about making complex brain surgeries more accessible to hospitals with limited resources. She had already trained surgeons from 3 continents, sharing her knowledge freely because she remembered what it was like to have doors closed in her face. These memories, these achievements, this legacy, they were bigger than any security guard's prejudice. Each step of her journey had prepared her for moments like this. She had earned her place in this terminal, in that private jet, and at that medical conference in Los Angeles. Her credentials weren't just papers on a desk. They were years of dedication, sacrifice, and excellence. As she refocused on Peterson's hostile face, Dr. Richardson felt a calm strength flow through her. She thought of all the young black students who would follow in her footsteps, all the future doctors who needed to see that it was possible. Her legacy wasn't just about proving Peterson wrong. It was about proving Mrs. Thompson, her mother, and herself right. The familiar voice that had called out grew closer, and Dr. Richardson knew that justice would prevail. Not because of luck, but because of every single step that had led her to this moment. Sandra Chen stood behind the flight coordinator's desk, unable to take her eyes off the scene unfolding in front of her. Just last week, she had been reading about Dr. Richardson in a medical journal. The article had praised her innovative surgical technique that had saved dozens of lives. Now, here was that same brilliant surgeon being treated like an intruder. Sandra's fingers moved quickly across her keyboard, pulling up Dr. Richardson's flight details. Everything was in perfect order: the private jet booking, the medical conference confirmation, even notes about her previous flights from this terminal. Her hand hovered over the phone, knowing she should call someone. But who? The supervisor? Security? The media? Around the terminal, other witnesses were having similar reactions. James Morrison, a tech CEO who flew private jets twice a week, had lowered his Wall Street Journal and was recording the incident on his phone. He had seen enough discrimination in his 30 years of business to recognize it instantly. His own daughter was in medical school, and the thought of her facing such treatment made his blood boil. "This is unacceptable," he muttered to his assistant, who nodded in agreement. Both of them had their phones out now, capturing every word of the exchange. The video would later go viral, but for now, they were just 2 more witnesses to injustice. Near the coffee station, 2 flight attendants, Maria Rodriguez and Ashley Thompson, watched with growing anger. They had served Dr. Richardson on previous flights and knew her reputation for kindness. Just last month, she had helped a passenger who had fallen ill during a flight, earning the respect of the entire crew. "That's Dr. Richardson," Maria whispered to Ashley. She performed emergency surgery on my nephew in Atlanta. She's literally a lifesaver. Ashley was already on the phone, quietly but urgently speaking to someone about the situation. A young black teenager, Keisha Jackson, sat in the corner with her wealthy aunt, watching the scene with wide eyes. She had been accepted to pre-med programs at 3 universities and was still trying to decide which one to choose. Watching Dr. Richardson stand her ground with such dignity, Keisha made her decision right there. She would become a doctor, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. The terminal's regular morning quiet had been replaced by a tense atmosphere. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, recording the confrontation from different angles. Some passengers whispered among themselves, others stood in silent support, and a few began to step forward, ready to intervene. An elderly man in an expensive suit, Judge William Harris, had seen enough. He had spent 40 years on the bench fighting against discrimination, and he wasn't about to sit quietly now. He rose from his seat, his reputation as a federal judge lending weight to his presence. But before he could speak, Lisa Martinez, another flight coordinator, rushed past him. She was carrying a stack of papers, printouts of Dr. Richardson's previous flight records from their terminal, news articles about her medical achievements, and the conference schedule showing her as the keynote speaker. "Mr. Peterson," Lisa called out, her voice firm despite her nervousness. "I have Dr. Richardson's complete flight history right here. She's one of our most respected regular passengers." The growing crowd had formed a loose circle around the security desk. Some were making phone calls, others were typing furiously on their phones, sharing the incident on social media. A corporate lawyer quietly began taking notes, his years of civil rights work telling him this might become a landmark case. Sandra Chen finally made her decision. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Captain Matthews?" "Yes, this is Sandra from the terminal. We have a situation here with one of your passengers, Dr. Richardson." "Yes, the neurosurgeon. Could you please come to the security desk? Immediately. Thank you." As she hung up, Sandra saw something that gave her hope. Through the terminal's large windows, she could see Captain Sarah Matthews already walking briskly toward the building. The captain's confident stride and determined expression suggested she wasn't about to let anyone prevent her passenger from boarding. The next few moments would change everything, not just for Dr. Richardson, but for everyone watching. Sometimes, Sandra thought, the most important moments in history happened in the most ordinary places, witnessed by ordinary people who chose not to stay silent. Captain Sarah Matthews strode through the terminal doors with the confidence of someone who had navigated both stormy skies and difficult situations for over 15 years. Her crisp pilot's uniform and 4 gold stripes commanded attention, but it was her purposeful walk that made people step aside. She had received Sandra's call just as she was finishing her pre-flight checks, and the mention of Dr. Richardson's name had made her move quickly. 3 months ago, Captain Matthews had flown Dr. Richardson to Miami for an emergency surgery. During that flight, she had learned about the doctor's remarkable work when they talked in the cockpit. She remembered how Dr. Richardson had explained complex brain procedures in simple terms, her passion for saving lives clear in every word. "What seems to be the problem here?" Captain Matthews's voice cut through the tense atmosphere like a knife through butter. She saw Dr. Richardson standing tall, her documents spread across the security desk, and security guard Peterson's hostile stance. The situation became clear immediately. Peterson straightened his uniform, trying to match the captain's authority. "Ma'am, I'm handling a security situation with someone trying to access the private terminal without proper—" "Stop right there," Captain Matthews interrupted, her voice firm but controlled. "This is Dr. Michelle Richardson, one of the most respected neurosurgeons in the country. She's flown with us multiple times." She turned to Dr. Richardson with a warm smile. "Good morning, doctor. I trust you're well?" The relief in the terminal was almost physical. Several onlookers nodded in approval, while others continued recording. Peterson's face had turned an interesting shade of red, but Captain Matthews wasn't finished. "In fact," she continued, pulling out her phone, "I have a photo from our Miami flight. The one where you performed emergency surgery on that 7-year-old girl." She showed the screen to Peterson. The photo showed Dr. Richardson and Captain Matthews in the cockpit, both smiling after a successful emergency flight. Peterson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I was just following protocol, he stammered, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Protocol? Captain Matthews raised an eyebrow. Protocol is checking documentation, which Dr. Richardson has provided. Protocol is treating all passengers with respect. Protocol is not making assumptions based on, she paused meaningfully, personal bias. The growing crowd murmured in agreement. Sandra Chen had come out from behind her desk, holding even more documentation. Captain, I have Dr. Richardson's complete flight history here, along with today's conference details where she's the keynote speaker. Dr. Richardson watched this exchange with dignity, her professional demeanor never wavering. She checked her watch. There were still 20 minutes until the scheduled departure time. Captain Matthews turned to address the terminal at large. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. Dr. Richardson is not only a highly respected passenger, but also someone who has saved countless lives, including on emergency flights from this very terminal. She faced Peterson again. Now, will there be any further issues with Dr. Richardson boarding her flight? Peterson's face had moved from red to pale. No, ma'am, he managed to say. The security guard seemed to shrink in his uniform as he realized the gravity of his mistake. Good, Captain Matthews nodded. Dr. Richardson, shall we proceed to the aircraft? I believe you have an important conference to attend. She gestured toward the doors leading to the tarmac. As they walked together, Captain Matthews spoke quietly to Dr. Richardson. I'm sorry you had to experience that, Doctor. Rest assured, this will be reported. Their footsteps echoed in the now quiet terminal. Behind them, Sandra Chen was already on the phone with the terminal manager, her voice carrying hints of both anger and determination. The other passengers had begun to disperse, but their phones held videos that would soon tell this story to the world. Peterson stood alone at his security desk, his earlier authority deflated. He watched as Dr. Richardson walked away with Captain Matthews, their figures silhouetted against the morning sun streaming through the terminal windows. In that moment, he realized he had not only failed at his job, but had become an example of everything that needed to change. The sound of aircraft engines warming up filled the air as Captain Matthews and Dr. Richardson approached the private jet. The morning sun glinted off its polished surface, promising to carry them away from this incident and toward something more important, a conference where Dr. Richardson's expertise would help shape the future of neurosurgery. The terminal supervisor, Robert Martinez, arrived just as Dr. Richardson and Captain Matthews were walking toward the aircraft. His usually calm face showed clear distress as he hurried through the terminal, his tie slightly crooked from his rushed journey from the main office. Sandra Chen had briefed him on the phone, and the gravity of the situation was written all over his face. Dr. Richardson, he called out, slightly out of breath. Please, wait a moment. He caught up with them near the terminal exit, his eyes showing genuine concern. I want to personally apologize for what happened here today. This is completely unacceptable. Dr. Richardson turned to face him, her professional composure still intact. She had already decided how to handle this situation during her long moments at the security desk. This wasn't about revenge or punishment, it was about creating change. Mr. Martinez, she said calmly, I appreciate your apology. But rather than focus on what went wrong today, I'd like to discuss how we can make things right for the future. She glanced at her watch. There was still time before her flight needed to leave. The supervisor nodded eagerly, pulling out a small notebook. Behind him, Peterson stood at his desk, now under the watch of another security officer. His face had lost all its previous arrogance, replaced by something that looked like shame. First, Dr. Richardson continued, I want to be clear that I'm not interested in having Mr. Peterson fired. Several witnesses who were still watching gasped in surprise. Firing one person doesn't solve the larger problem. Instead, I would like to propose something more constructive. Captain Matthews smiled knowingly. She'd had seen this side of Dr. Richardson during their previous flights, always looking for solutions rather than punishments. I regularly speak about diversity and inclusion at medical conferences, Dr. Richardson explained. I would be willing to return and conduct a training session for your entire staff. Not just about avoiding discrimination, but about understanding and appreciating diversity in all its forms. Martinez scribbled frantically in his notebook, nodding enthusiastically. That would be incredibly valuable, Dr. Richardson. We would be honored. He looked up, his expression serious. Of course, this doesn't excuse what happened today. There will be immediate consequences and policy changes. Sandra Chen stepped forward, still holding the stack of documents. I've already started drafting a new check-in protocol, she said. One that requires thorough document review before any passenger is questioned or delayed. Dr. Richardson nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of systematic change we need. She turned to Captain Matthews. Now, I believe we have a schedule to keep. But before they could move toward the door, Peterson stepped forward hesitantly. The second security officer watched him closely, but Peterson's body language had completely changed. He kept his eyes on the floor as he spoke. Dr. Richardson, he said quietly, I was wrong. My behavior was inexcusable. He finally looked up, his face showing genuine regret. I've worked here 6 years, and today I learned that I've been part of the problem. I would like to be part of the solution, if you'll let me. The terminal fell silent, waiting for Dr. Richardson's response. She studied Peterson's face for a moment before speaking. Mr. Peterson, change begins with acknowledgement. You've taken that first step. I look forward to seeing you at the training session. Relief washed over Peterson's face as Dr. Richardson turned back to Martinez. Please have your office contact my assistant to schedule the training. Now, if you'll excuse me, there are medical professionals in Los Angeles waiting to learn about a new surgical technique that could save their patients' lives. As she and Captain Matthews finally walked out onto the tarmac, the morning sun had fully risen, casting long shadows behind them. The private jet's engines hummed with ready energy, much like the atmosphere of change now flowing through the terminal. Inside, Martinez was already on his phone, making calls to implement immediate policy changes. Sandra Chen had returned to her desk to formalize the new check-in protocols. And Peterson sat quietly at his desk, looking at a photo of his young daughter on his phone, thinking about the world he wanted her to grow up in. The incident was over, but its impact was just beginning. Sometimes, Dr. Richardson thought as she climbed the stairs to the aircraft, the most powerful changes came not from confrontation, but from choosing a better path forward. By the time Dr. Richardson's plane landed in Los Angeles, the videos of the incident had already spread across social media, but something unexpected happened. Instead of focusing on the discrimination she faced, people were sharing her impressive medical achievements and professional response to the situation. Keisha Jackson, the young black teenager who had witnessed everything at the terminal, posted her video with a powerful message. Today I watched Dr. Michelle Richardson handle racism with grace and turn it into a teaching moment. She's the kind of doctor I want to become. The post quickly gathered thousands of likes and shares. In her dorm room at Howard University, pre-med student Taylor Williams watched the video for the 5th time. She had been doubting her ability to handle the pressure of medical school, but seeing Dr. Richardson's composure gave her new strength. Taylor shared the video in her study group chat, writing, "This is what excellence looks like. No matter what they throw at us, we rise." The story caught the attention of major news networks. Instead of just reporting on the discrimination, they highlighted Dr. Richardson's groundbreaking surgical technique and her history of emergency flights to save lives across the country. Medical journals that had published her research saw a surge in readers, especially among young black students interested in neuroscience. At Atlanta General Hospital, Dr. Richardson's team watched the videos with pride. They had always known their department head was special, but now the world was seeing it too. The hospital's email system was flooded with messages from people asking about their neurosurgery residency program, particularly from minority students who saw a future for themselves in medicine. Sandra Chen, the flight coordinator who had witnessed everything, wrote a detailed post about Dr. Richardson's previous flights from the terminal. She described how the doctor had once delayed her own vacation to take an emergency flight for a patient in critical condition. "This is who they tried to stop today," Sandra wrote. "A woman who has saved more lives than I can count." The medical conference organizers in Los Angeles were worried that Dr. Richardson might cancel her keynote speech after the morning's events. Instead, she arrived exactly on time, her presentation ready and her spirit unshaken. The conference hall was packed beyond capacity, with young medical students standing in the back just to hear her speak. Dr. Richardson began her presentation as planned, explaining her new surgical technique with clarity and expertise. But then she did something unexpected. She added a new slide to her presentation. It showed a photo of her younger self, standing in front of Johns Hopkins Medical School on her first day. Excellence, she told the audience, doesn't ask permission to exist. It doesn't wait for acceptance. It simply is. And when we face barriers, we use them as steps to climb higher. The room erupted in applause, with many students wiping tears from their eyes. Back in Atlanta, applications to the hospital's medical internship program doubled overnight. Young black students who had been hesitant to pursue their dreams of becoming doctors found new courage. Their social media posts all carried the same message. If Dr. Richardson did it, so can I. The impact spread beyond medicine. Other professionals shared their own stories of breaking barriers and refusing to be stopped by prejudice. A movement was growing, centered not on anger, but on excellence and determination. Peterson's honest admission of his mistake and willingness to change became part of the story too. Corporate training programs began using the incident as a case study in bias awareness and professional development. His transformation showed that change was possible when people were willing to learn and grow. 3 weeks later, Dr. Richardson received a letter from a 12-year-old girl in Detroit. The girl wrote about watching the video and deciding she wanted to become a brain surgeon too. "People might tell me I can't," the girl wrote, "but I'll remember you and keep going." Dr. Richardson pinned this letter on her office wall, right next to her medical degrees and certificates. To her, it represented something more valuable than any professional achievement: the power to inspire the next generation to dream bigger and reach higher. The incident that could have been just another viral video about discrimination had transformed into something more powerful, a catalyst for change, a source of inspiration, and a reminder that excellence speaks louder than prejudice. Dr. Richardson's legacy was no longer just about the lives she saved in the operating room, but about the dreams she awakened in countless young minds. 6 months had passed since that morning at Atlanta International Airport, and Dr. Richardson found herself walking through the same private terminal again. This time, everything was different. The security desk where Peterson had once stood was now staffed by a diverse team of officers, all wearing new badges that showed they had completed comprehensive diversity training. Sandra Chen, now promoted to head of terminal operations, greeted Dr. Richardson with a warm smile. The changes they had implemented together over the past months had transformed not just this terminal, but had become a model for private airports across the country. "Good morning, Dr. Richardson," Sandra said, leading her toward the conference room. "Everyone's waiting for you. Today wasn't about catching a flight, it was about sharing knowledge and creating more change." The terminal's main conference room was filled with staff members from every department. Security officers, flight coordinators, maintenance crews, and even pilots had gathered for Dr. Richardson's quarterly diversity training session. In the front row sat Thomas Peterson, who had chosen to stay with the company and become an advocate for change. "Today," Dr. Richardson began, standing at the podium, "we're not just talking about avoiding discrimination. We're talking about creating a world where everyone's excellence is recognized and celebrated." She clicked to her first slide, which showed the viral video from 6 months ago, now viewed by millions. The room was silent, some people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. But Peterson raised his hand, surprising everyone. "If I may," he said, standing up, "I'd like to share how this incident changed me." Dr. Richardson nodded, giving him the floor. Peterson turned to face his colleagues. "That day, I wasn't just wrong about Dr. Richardson. I was wrong about everything I thought I knew about judging people. My daughter recently told me she wants to be a pilot, and now I know better than to let anyone tell her what she can't do." At the back of the room, Captain Sarah Matthews smiled. She had become a mentor to Peterson's daughter, inviting her to explore the cockpit and learn about aviation. The young girl's eyes had lit up with the same dreams that had once driven Matthews to become a pilot. During a break in the session, Dr. Richardson walked through the terminal, observing the changes. New artwork on the walls celebrated diversity in aviation and medicine. The security checkpoint had been redesigned to be more welcoming, with clear procedures posted to ensure fair treatment for all passengers. A young black woman in a crisp business suit approached her, eyes shining with recognition. "Dr. Richardson, I'm Keisha Jackson. I was here that day with my aunt. I just wanted you to know I'm starting medical school next fall." Dr. Richardson hugged her, remembering the teenager who had watched everything unfold 6 months ago. "Keep flying high, Keisha. The sky's not the limit anymore. It's just the beginning. Near the end of her presentation, Dr. Richardson shared something special, a new scholarship program she had created with the airport authority. That Excellence Has No Barriers scholarship would help minority students pursue careers in aviation and medicine. Change, she told the audience, isn't just about fixing what's wrong. It's about creating new opportunities for what's right. She revealed that the first scholarship had already been awarded to a young woman who wanted to become both a pilot and a doctor. As the session ended, the terminal staff gathered around Dr. Richardson, sharing their own stories of growth and change. Peterson approached last, holding a framed photo of his daughter sitting in Captain Matthews' cockpit, beaming with joy. "Thank you," he said simply, "for showing me a better way." Outside, the afternoon sun painted the terminal in warm colors. Dr. Richardson watched as a diverse group of passengers moved smoothly through security, each treated with the same respect and professionalism. A new sign above the security desk read, "Excellence welcomes everyone." Sandra joined her by the window, both women watching planes take off into the golden sky. "You know," Sandra said, "what happened that day was terrible, but look at all the good that grew from it." Dr. Richardson nodded, thinking of all the lives touched and changed, the barriers broken, the dreams unleashed. Sometimes the best response to darkness was not to curse it, but to light 1,000 new paths forward. As she prepared to leave, Dr. Richardson saw her reflection in the terminal's glass windows. A strong, accomplished woman who had turned an obstacle into an opportunity, not just for herself, but for generations to come. Her legacy spoke volumes, and its echo would continue to inspire long after the last ripples of that morning's events had faded away.